This is Jerusalem, the heart of Israel. It is a place called by God in the book of Ezekiel, the center of all nations. Indeed it is. Nearly 2,500 years have passed since this prophetic verse was written, and today the peace of all nations balances precariously upon the events that happen here. There is no city on the face of the earth as important. Its very existence provides sanctuary and peace for a nation. Yet it fuels the flames of world terrorism and led us to the events of 9/11. For all humanity, Israel is the key to the peace of the world and to future events. What are the future events? Are they written in Bible prophecy? Can we understand what is to take place in this remarkable land? What you are about to discover is amazing. But before we acknowledge such a possibility, let's briefly look at the history of Jerusalem. The first mention of the city by the name of Jerusalem is found in the book of Joshua in the 10th chapter. We are told here that Adonai-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, led a coalition of kings against Joshua and the Israelites. After a fierce battle, the Israelites defeated them in the valley of Ayalon. However, it wasn't until 2 centuries later, sometime around 1000 BC, that King David conquered the city from the Jebusites and made it the capital of the Jewish nation. Later, David's son Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem. King Solomon had great dreams for this new nation, but it was not to be. Not long after his death, the kingdom split into 2 nations. The northern nation of Israel was doomed from the start, with corrupt kings and lawlessness that lasted for 200 years. In contrast, the southern nation of Judah prospered and even retained Jerusalem as its capital. Over time, though, Judah also began to fall into corruption and disarray, and so began the demise of the promised Jewish homeland, just as Ezekiel prophesied.
For thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will deliver thee into the hand of them whom thou hatest, into the hand of them from whom thy mind is alienated. They shall deal with thee hatefully, and shall take away all thy labor, and shall leave thee naked and bare.
In the 10th and 11th chapters of the book of Daniel, the prophet writes specifically about who these conquering armies will be.
Lo, the prince of Grecia shall come, and by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. And not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those.
Overwhelmed by the armies of Alexander the Great, Israel fell under Greek rule in 340 BC. Later, the Romans invaded and occupied the region until they were eventually driven out by the Byzantines. Over hundreds of years, one invading army after another conquered and destroyed Jerusalem, nearly leveling it to the ground each time, dispersing the Jewish people out from this land. For centuries they migrated all over the world. This brings us to a point in time where we can evaluate the prophecy of Israel as fact or fiction. For it is during this time that we begin to see the realization of events documented in writing, over 2,000 years before they happened.
Let's begin with one of the most gruesome prophecies in the Bible. It is a prophecy given by Moses concerning the worldwide dispersion and persecution of the Jewish people. And to provide that prophecy with a proper context, let's go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. This ghastly sculpture of prisoners dying on electrified barbed wire is on the grounds of the Jewish National Memorial to the Holocaust victims. Every time I come here, I think of the prophecy that God delivered through Moses, warning the Jewish people that if they were not faithful to him, he would cause them to be dispersed and persecuted all over the world.
And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught. And ye shall be plucked from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. The Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life.
For the past 1900 years, the Jewish people have wandered the earth in fulfillment of this prophecy, being harassed and persecuted wherever they went.
So how is it that a civilization can remain intact after being scattered across the planet for nearly 2,000 years? This certainly does not seem to be true for the biblical enemies of Israel. The Amalekites, the Philistines, the Ammonites, and many others have long since disappeared. Here opens the era of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. These men are referred to as the major prophets from the size and importance of their books. Minor prophets, such as Amos, Zephaniah, and Daniel, also wrote prophecies that state many times that the people will remain as one people, and no obstacle will prevent the restoration of Israel.
Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Yea, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee. Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever.
The prophet Ezekiel lived in Israel around 586 BC. During this time, he had a remarkable vision called the Valley of the Dry Bones.
I'm standing at the top of the Kidron Valley, a deep ravine that runs north and south, separating the old city on the west from the Mount of Olives over here on the east. As you can see, the Mount of Olives is covered with thousands of graves. The reason that this is such a popular burial place is because the prophet Zechariah says that when the Messiah returns, he will return to the Mount of Olives. And so it is believed those buried here will be the first to be resurrected. Every time I stand here, I am reminded of the great prophecy of Ezekiel about the end-time regathering of the Jewish people. It is recorded in Ezekiel 37.
And he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come up out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel.
That vision was given to Ezekiel 2,500 years ago. According to the vision, a time would come when the Jewish people as a nation would appear to be without hope. But just at the time when the world would write off the Jews as a hopeless people, God would resurrect them from their graves and bring them home to Israel. And note, Ezekiel said they would be regathered to Israel, not to Canaan, or Zion, or the Holy Land, or Palestine, but Israel. And that is precisely the name this land was given when the Jewish state was reestablished in 1948. Isaiah says that the root of Jesse will stand as a flag that will signal to the Jewish people to come home to Israel from the four corners of the earth.
And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse which shall stand for an ensign of the people, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth.
Notice what is right in the center. The symbol of the root of Jesse, the symbol of David. And just as Isaiah prophesied, it has served as a magnet to draw the Jewish people from all over the world.
This is Tel Aviv, a bustling, modern city of 500,000 people. It's hard to believe that this city did not even exist at the beginning of the 20th century. Its newness is even more spectacular when you consider the fact that it is located in a land where most of the cities are 3,000 years old or older. Tel Aviv is significant in prophecy because this is the place where the modern-day state of Israel was proclaimed to the world. Although Tel Aviv itself is not mentioned in prophecy, the re-establishment of the state of Israel, which took place here, is prophesied over and over again.
Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, The Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the lands whither he had driven them. And I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers.
People laughed and scoffed and ridiculed this teaching because they felt there was no possibility whatsoever that the state of Israel would ever be reestablished. In fact, some people laughed right up to the very day that the Declaration of Independence was declared here in Tel Aviv on May the 14th, 1948. This building is where the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed to the world. At that time, it was the Tel Aviv Library. Today, it is a museum. The Declaration was read to the world by David Ben-Gurion, the man who was destined to become the first Prime Minister of Israel. David Ben-Gurion stepped up to this podium at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, May 14th, 1948, the 5th day of the month of Iyar, in the year 5708 of the Hebrew calendar.
Reading from the Declaration, he said, "Exiled from the land of Israel, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all the countries of their dispersion, never ceasing to pray and hope for their return and the restoration of their national freedom. Impelled by this historic association, Jews strove throughout the centuries to go back to the land of their fathers and regain their statehood. In recent decades, they returned in masses, reclaimed the wilderness, revived their language, and built cities and villages. It is," he continued, "the self-evident right of the Jewish people to be a nation, as all other nations, in their own sovereign state. Accordingly," he added, "by virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people and the resolution of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel."
That Declaration of Independence, David Ben-Gurion mentioned the reclamation of the land. And that, my friends, brings us to the third prophecy that has been fulfilled in this century. And to fully appreciate it, we need to go to the Judean wilderness.
צמודים, זאת השאלה.
The point that I want to make to you is at the beginning of the 20th century, all of Israel looked like this. It was a place of desolation, and it was a fulfillment of Bible prophecy.
So that the generation to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land, shall say, when they see the plagues of that land, and the sickness which the Lord hath laid upon it, and that the whole land thereof is brimstone, and salt, and burning, that it is not sown, nor beareth, nor any grass groweth therein, even all the nations shall say, Wherefore hath the Lord done thus unto this land? What meaneth the heat of this great anger? Then men shall say, Because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods, and worshipped them, gods whom they knew not, and whom he had not given unto them. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land to bring upon it all the curses that are written in this book. And the Lord rooted them out of their land in anger and in wrath and in great indignation.
The land will become brimstone and salt, a burning waste. And that's exactly what happened to this land after the Jews were driven out in 70 AD. The trees were cut down, the soil eroded, the rainfall dwindled, and it became a land of nomads and desolation. The great American novelist Mark Twain came here in 1866. Listen to his description of the land in his book, Innocents Abroad. "It is a blistering, naked, treeless land." Concerning the Galilee area, he wrote, "One may ride 10 miles in any direction and not see 10 human beings. The area is a fulfillment of the Bible prophecy that says, 'I will bring the land into desolation.'"
Let me give you an example of how completely this prophecy was fulfilled. In the Bible, you read about great forests in the land full of wild animals. But by 1917, there were only 15,000 trees left in the land. The forests and the animals were gone. Let's take a look at this map. Here's where the city of Jerusalem is located. Tel Aviv is here on the coast, and Haifa up here. Everything south of a line from Haifa to the Sea of Galilee, everything south was barren territory at the beginning of this century. And all the great agricultural valleys were malaria-infested swamplands. The Valley of Ayalon, the Valley of Sharon, the Valley of Jezreel, better known as the Valley of Armageddon, and the Valley of Hula, to the north of the Sea of Galilee, were all malaria-infested swamplands. But I rejoice to tell you that is no longer true. Since the Jews have returned to this land during this century, the curse has been lifted. Let me show you. Let's go to the Valley of Ayalon. This is what the former wasteland looks like today. Israel is once again a land of milk and honey, and this is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy.
Thus saith the Lord God, in the day that I shall have cleansed you from all your iniquities, I will also cause you to dwell in the cities, and the wastes shall be builded, and the desolate land shall be tilled, whereas it lay desolate in the sight of all that passed by. And they shall say, this land that was desolate is become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate and ruined cities are become fenced and are inhabited. Then the heathen that are left round about you shall know that I, the Lord, build the ruined places and plant that was desolate. I, the Lord, have spoken it, and I will do it.
Here is one of the keys to the fulfillment of that prophecy: the channeling of water for irrigation purposes. Much of this water comes from the Sea of Galilee. It is pumped out of the sea and put into a conduit called the National Water Carrier. The Israelis have also developed innovative irrigation techniques. Instead of watering the crops with sprinkler systems, they use a technique called drip irrigation. The water is channeled through these rubber tubes, which release only a few drops of precious water to each individual plant or tree. This technique cuts down on water loss through evaporation. All this imaginative use of water brings us to the intriguing vision of the future that the prophet Isaiah foretold when he wrote,
For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert, and the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water.
The third key to the reclamation of the land, in addition to trees and water, has been labor, hard labor. I'm standing on the grounds of Yad Mordechai Kibbutz. A kibbutz is a communal farm that is owned and operated collectively by the people who live on it.
The kibbutz is the backbone of Israeli agriculture, and today there are more than 200 kibbutzim in the country that have transformed this land from desolation to farmland. Amazingly, the prophet Ezekiel not only predicted the repossession and cultivation of the land, he goes on to dictate that God will punish those who oppose these efforts and the nation of Israel.
Thus saith the Lord God, when I shall have gathered the house of Israel from the people among whom they are scattered, and shall be sanctified in them in the sight of the heathen, then shall they dwell in their land that I have given to my servant Jacob. And they shall dwell safely therein, and shall build houses and plant vineyards. Yea, they shall dwell with confidence, when I have executed judgments upon all those that despise them round about them. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God.
Very few languages in the world are unchanged by time. One of the most amazing realizations of prophecies regarding Israel is the rebirth of the Hebrew language. This language was long forgotten and rarely heard for over 1,000 years, but in the 20th century it was miraculously revived and became a pure speech once again.
For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent.
What's so special about this sign? It is written in Hebrew. Maybe you're thinking, well, what's the big deal? Well, consider this. The Hebrew language as a daily language of communication died out almost 1,900 years ago. You see, when the Romans dispersed the Jews among the nations in 70 A.D., the Jewish people gradually abandoned the Hebrew language until it was used only in the synagogues for prayer and for the reading of Scripture. Hebrew became a sacred language and ceased to be used in secular life. The Jews of Europe spoke Yiddish, a combination of Hebrew and German. The Jews around the Mediterranean basin mixed Hebrew with Spanish to produce a language called Ladino. At the turn of this century, the Jews in this land spoke either Ladino, Yiddish, Turkish, or Arabic. Hebrew as a spoken language was simply dead. But biblical Hebrew has been resurrected from the dead. It is the language of modern-day Israel. It's the language that you see here on this sign. Let's go to Ben Yehuda Street in New Jerusalem to consider how this miracle came to be.
Ben Yehuda Street is one of the central gathering places of New Jerusalem. It is named for Eliezer ben Yehuda, the man who virtually single-handedly revived the Hebrew language from the dead. Ben Yehuda was born in 1858 in Lithuania. At an early age, he became obsessed with the revival of the Hebrew language. He came to this country in 1881 at the age of 23 and dedicated his life to making biblical Hebrew the tongue of the Jewish people.
I want you to just stop and think for a moment what it would be like to try to revive a language that had not been used in 2,000 years. Let me give you an example. 700 years ago, English sounded like this. One that April with its sure sota, the drut of March hath passed to the rota, and bathed every vein in swish liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Well, believe it or not, that is English. I've just quoted you a stanza from the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. Now, I want you to think how impossible it would be to take a language like that and modernize it, inventing words for every historical event that has occurred, for every technological development. And I want you to think, too, how impossible it would be to convince people to learn that language and to speak it once you had revived it. Well, that's exactly what this amazing man, Ben Yehuda, did. Let me show you here in Jerusalem where he lived and worked.
This is the building where Eliezer ben Yehuda labored to revive the Hebrew language. His task was made especially difficult by the fact that the world had changed drastically since the Hebrew language was spoken in 70 AD. Inventions like electricity, a car, a radio, needed to have an entirely new word created based upon the roots of ancient Hebrew. Even more remarkable is the fact that Ben Yehuda suffered from the torturous disease of tuberculosis and was opposed by virtually everyone. The Zionists were not interested in the revival of a dead religious language. They were modern secularists. The Orthodox Jews were outraged over the idea of their sacred language of the synagogue becoming the common language of the streets.
And the Orthodox Jews continue to this day to express their outrage against Ben Yehuda by removing the plaque that the Jewish government has placed here to honor him. But Ben Yehuda was determined, and in 1922, just 3 months before he died, the League of Nations designated Biblical Hebrew as the official language of Palestine. And in 1948, it became the official language of the State of Israel.
Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, as yet they shall use this speech in the land of Judah and in the cities thereof, when I shall bring again their captivity. The Lord bless thee, O habitation of justice and mountain of holiness.
Each person who immigrates to Israel today must learn Hebrew, and thus they are enabled to read the scriptures in their original language. With extraordinary eloquence, this fulfills the prophecy in Zephaniah 3:9 that says the Lord will give his people a pure speech. A fifth prophecy fulfilled in our day is the resurgence of the Israeli military. This is Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, located in southwest Israel on the coast near the Gaza Strip. This kibbutz is named for the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which occurred during World War II. In 1948, when the independence of Israel was proclaimed, this kibbutz was one of the most isolated in all the country. It was surrounded by Arabs on all sides. Because of its strategic location on the main highway between Cairo and Tel Aviv, the kibbutz became a prime target for the advancing Egyptian army. The people of this kibbutz showed the courage of their namesake, Mordechai. Fighting with only small handguns from primitive trenches, they halted the advance of the Egyptian army for 5 days. Those 5 days proved crucial in preparing the defenses of Tel Aviv.
This is one of the Egyptian tanks that was destroyed at this battle site. When the War of 48 began, the Jewish state had only 18,900 men mobilized and armed to resist 5 Arab armies. The heavy artillery of the Jewish army consisted of 1 homemade cannon and a few 3-inch mortars. There was not a single warplane in all the country. And yet, through determination, the Jews were able to repel the Arab attack and win the war.
Today, only 50 years later, Israel stands as one of the premier military powers in the entire world. In fact, many military experts rate Israel as the 4th most powerful conventional and nuclear-armed nation in the world, behind the United States, Russia, and China.
What makes that even more remarkable is that Israel is one of the world's smallest nations. It is smaller than the state of New Jersey and has a population less than the city of Philadelphia. Yet this tiny country ranks 4th in military power, and many would rank it 1st in the effective use of that power.
And I was with thee whithersoever thou went, and have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as before time, and as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies. In that day will I make the governors of Judah like an hearth of fire among the wood, and like a torch of fire in a sheaf. And they shall devour all the people round about on the right hand and on the left. And Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem.
I have thus far identified 5 Bible prophecies concerning Israel that were fulfilled in the 20th century. The regathering of the people, the reestablishment of the state, the reclamation of the land, the revival of the language, the resurgence of the military. We're now ready to look at the 6th prophecy, which concerns the refocusing of world politics upon the nation of Israel. For that story, we need to return to Tel Aviv. I'm standing here in front of the American Embassy. This is a most unusual American embassy because it's the only one I know of anywhere in the world that is not located in the host country's capital city. You see, Tel Aviv is not the capital of Israel. Jerusalem is the capital. Why is our embassy here? Because in 1973, when we came to the aid of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Arabs retaliated by pulling an oil boycott on us. Remember those long gas lines in the States? That boycott brought us to our knees and made us realize how vulnerable we had become in our dependence on Arab oil. When we went to the Arabs with our hat in our hand begging for oil, they said we would have to pay 2 prices. First, we would have to pay 4 times more for the oil than ever before. And second, They demanded that the Western world line up with them in their opposition to the State of Israel. Overnight, the spotlight of world politics was focused on Israel, and the Western democracies literally flip-flopped in their support of this nation. They withdrew their embassies from Jerusalem, and they began to vote against Israel in the United Nations.
The tiny nation of Israel suddenly became the focal point of world politics, just as was prophesied by Zechariah.
Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people.
The Arab nations insist that the Jews have no right to the land. They argue that the Jews forcibly acquired the land, overthrowing a Palestinian state in the process and scattering its people, making them homeless refugees. The controversy over the land of Israel is not as complicated as it may seem. It is very much like a house that was vacated and left empty, but never sold nor officially claimed by anyone else. For over 1,500 years, from the time Moses led the Hebrew slaves to the land of Canaan until the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, the land was continuously occupied by the Jewish people. When they were dispersed all over the world by the Romans, the land fell desolate and never became the homeland of any other people. There was never a Palestinian state, and the area was occupied by Bedouins and Arabs who considered themselves to be Syrians. Jerusalem has never been the capital of an Arab state, and even though the Temple Mount is the site of a mosque and a shrine considered holy to the Islamic faith, the word Jerusalem does not appear in the Quran, whereas it is mentioned over 600 times in the Hebrew scriptures. As the Hebrew prophets clearly predicted that the land would become an uninhabited wasteland that no one would care about once the Jews were evicted, they also prophesied over and over again that one day the Jews would be regathered back to their land. The fulfillment of these prophecies began in the late 19th century, when a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl became convinced that the Jews of Europe would never be as one people unless they returned to their homeland. Herzl put his ideas into writing in a booklet called The Jewish State. It caught the imagination of the Jewish people and led to the first Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. At that conference, Herzl proclaimed that he believed a Jewish state would come into existence within 50 years. That statement proved to be prophetic. Jews began to stream back to their homeland, purchasing arid desert land and malaria-infested swamps. The next crucial turning point came during World War I. During that war, the Turks sided with the Germans. When the Germans lost the war, so did the Turks. Both the German and Turkish empires were divided up by the Allies. Palestine, a name describing a desert region, not a country, had been part of the Turkish Empire for 400 years, ever since 1517. In 1920, Palestine was assigned to the British as a League of Nations mandate. This meant the British would be responsible for establishing the people with an eventual self-government. 3 years earlier, in November 1917, in anticipation of receiving the territory of Palestine, the British had issued the Balfour Declaration, in which they declared that it was their intention to provide a homeland for the Jewish people within Palestine. Arabs in the area were outraged by this promise, and in 1922, the British Foreign Secretary, Winston Churchill, decided to give the Arabs 2/3 of the land the Jews had hoped to receive. This land was used to create the new state of Jordan, a territory overwhelmingly populated by Palestinians. This is the reason that many historians have stated that a Palestinian state already exists. Jordan not only contains an astounding 2/3 of the geography of historic Palestine, its population is also over 75% Palestinian. In 1947, the United Nations voted for the British mandate to end, and for the State of Israel to be created. But to the shock of the Jews, the UN proposed dividing the Jews 1/3 of the territory between them and the Arabs, leaving Israel with only 15% of the land they had originally hoped to receive under the terms of the Balfour Declaration. However, the Arabs declared they wanted all the land, so they launched an attack on the Jews to destroy any hopes of them forming the nation of Israel. As long as the Arabs were winning the war, the UN simply looked on as an observer. But the moment the Jews turned the tide and started winning, the UN intervened and insisted on a ceasefire. In 1949, the so-called West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was annexed by Egypt. Jerusalem was left divided. The Jews had control of Western Jerusalem. The Jordanians controlled the Old City and East Jerusalem. Under the armistice terms, the Jordanians agreed to give the Jews access to the Western Wall for prayer. But once the agreement was signed, the Jordanians refused to honor this agreement. No Jews were allowed to go to the wall for the next 18 years. The Jordanians also blew up all of the Jewish quarter in the Old City, including the ancient synagogues, which resulted in a tremendous loss of glorious architecture. In the Six-Day War of June 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and all the Sinai Peninsula. Under international law, Israel was entitled to keep these lands because they were won in a defensive war. However, in 1978, Israel surrendered the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in return for a peace treaty. Since that time, through the Oslo peace process, the Palestinians have been granted the Gaza Strip and most of the West Bank. But this still has not provided a peaceful resolve because they do not accept the declaration of the existence of Israel. Extraordinarily, when the West Bank and Gaza were under Jordanian autonomy, the PLO was formed to represent the Palestinians, but never organized itself to create a state, only to drive out the Jewish state, even though the Palestinians have always had complete access to their holy shrines.
I am standing at the Lion's Gate of the Old City, also known as St. Stephen's Gate. Let me show you this gate on a diagram. Here is the outline of the Old City. The gate at the north is the Damascus Gate. On the west, the Jaffa, the Zion Gate. This is the Kidron Valley running down between the city on the west and the Mount of Olives over here on the east. We are standing here at the Lion's Gate. This is the gate that the commandos entered in 1948. The Mount of Olives is right across, the Old City over here, and here is the Temple Mound. This right here indicates the Golden Gate, or the Eastern Gate, that is currently shut. In 1948, when the war ended, the city was divided between the Israelis and the Jordanians along this line, with Israel on this side and Jordan over here. According to the prophet Ezekiel, this gate, the Golden Gate, will not be opened until the Messiah returns.
Nobody knows for certain why the gate was ever closed, but it was shut almost 500 years ago in 1517. It occurred when the Turkish Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, conquered the city and decided to rebuild the walls. The legend is that while the walls were being rebuilt, a rumor spread that a Jewish Messiah was coming. When Suleiman inquired as to the meaning of the rumor, the Jewish rabbis explained that their scriptures, known as the Torah, prophesied that one day a Messiah king will come from the east, and that he will enter the city through the Eastern Gate, and will liberate the Jews from their oppressors. To prevent this, Suleiman ordered that the Eastern Gate be sealed, and that a Muslim cemetery be placed in front of it. He believed those two actions would stop any Jewish holy man who might try to liberate the city. The gate has been closed since that time. However, he unwittingly placed an unfulfilled prophecy in motion.
Then he brought me back the way of the gate of the outward sanctuary which looketh toward the east, and it was shut. Then said the Lord unto me, This gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no man shall enter in by it. Because the Lord, the God of Israel, hath entered in by it, therefore it shall be shut. It is for the prince. The prince, he shall sit in it to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by the way of the porch of that gate, and shall go out by the way of the same.
For 19 years, the Jordanians refused to allow Jews to enter the Old City to pray at the sacred Western Wall or Wailing Wall, but all that changed drastically and dramatically in June of 1967 when the Six-Day War broke out with Egypt. The Egyptians persuaded the Jordanians to enter the war, and when they did, the Israelis stormed the Old City. They broke into the city at the Lion's Gate. You can still see the pockmarks left in the wall from the fierce firefight that occurred there. The soldiers headed immediately for the Western Wall, the most sacred spot in all this land to the Jewish people. Let's go there.
The Western Wall is significant because it is the only thing that the Romans left standing when Titus destroyed the Holy Temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Since that time, it has become the center of mourning over the destruction of the temple and Israel's exile. It represents to the Jewish people the memory of Israel's former glory and the hope for its restoration. Because of this association, it is also referred to as the Wailing Wall.
This sacred site looks much different today from what it did in 1967. All the open space was filled with squatter shacks then. In other words, the wall could be accessed only by a narrow alleyway. The soldiers rushed to the alley that day to touch the sacred wall. Some shouted praises to God. Others wept in thanksgiving. The chief rabbi of the Israeli army, Rabbi Shlomo Guren, also rushed to the wall. He blew a ram's horn in signal for silence. He then made a momentous announcement. I proclaim to you the beginning of the Messianic age.
For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
This city fell to the Gentiles 40 years after Jesus spoke those words. The Romans conquered it under Titus. The Romans were followed by the Byzantines by the Arabs by the Crusaders by the Mamluks by the Turks by the British, and the British by the Jordanians. Jerusalem was trampled by the Gentiles from 70 AD until 1967. On June the 7th, 1967, it passed back into the hands of the Jewish people for the first time in 1,897 years. We have completed our survey of fulfilled Bible prophecy in the land of Israel. The Jewish people have been regathered. The nation of Israel has been reestablished. The land of Israel has been reclaimed. The Hebrew language has been revived. The Israeli military has experienced a great resurgence in power, and Israel is once again the focus of world politics. And one other thing, the Jewish people have reoccupied the city of Jerusalem.
Where does this leave the Arabs? As descendants of Abraham's son, Ishmael, they too should certainly be mentioned in prophecy. They are, but the prophecies do not relate to the regathering of a people or the promise of land which Israel claims today. The prophecies in Genesis 16 and 17 that relate to the Arabs promise that the descendants of Ishmael will be great in number and will occupy all the lands to the east of Israel.
And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation.
this prophecy has undeniably been fulfilled. Today there are 200 million Arabs. There is only one Jewish state with a population of 5.2 million Jews. The Arab states contain 5.3 million square miles of oil-rich land. Israel has only 8,000 square miles of land. But what about the Palestinian people? Don't they deserve a state? Keep in mind that for 1,878 years, which is from 70 AD to 1948, the geographical area known as Palestine was never an independent state. It had become an uninhabitable wasteland, as the prophets predicted. There was no vision to create a Palestinian state, because the few inhabitants that survived there regarded themselves as Syrians, and the primary area occupied by Palestinians became Jordan. Despite this, the Palestinians still consider Israel an occupied territory. In the 12th chapter of Zechariah, the prophet tells us that the conflict for the land will eventually bring all nations against Israel.
The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens and layeth the foundation of the earth and formeth the spirit of man within it. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it.
With the tremendous violence currently taking place in Israel and around the Middle East, this prophecy is now unfolding right before our very eyes. But even more amazing is that the prophecy goes on to guarantee Israel divine intervention and protection in the escalating conflict.
In that day shall the Lord defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he that is feeble among them at that day shall be as David, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of the Lord before them. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem.
What does all this mean for you and me? First, it's important to consider the extraordinary realization that we are witnessing these events taking place during the time you and I are here on this earth. Events that were foretold to us thousands of years ago. If we could spin the clock back just a mere 100 years, virtually none of these prophecies about Israel would have any significance at all, because they seemed impossible. But now we are observing the impossible as a way of life. And despite the efforts of those who hate Israel and torment the nation, and others that support them with continued violence and suicide bombings, the world bears witness that it is a revived nation that has and will continue to fulfill this prophecy that was written in 750 BC by the prophet Amos.
Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that soweth seed. And the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. And I will bring again the captivity of my people of Israel. And they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. And they shall plant vineyards, and drink the wine thereof. They shall also make gardens, and eat the fruit of them. And I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land which I have given them, saith the Lord thy God.
The more we all become aware of the history and the fulfillment of the destiny of the Jewish people, and the more the world is willing to accept it, the closer humanity will be to the dawn of peace in the Middle East, and to an understanding of the prophecy of Israel.